Today, we will have a more detailed discussion on the history of debt accumulation in the Asian region, the conditionalities and debt relief schemes, as well as a deeper look at the debt problem and the debt justice in four countries, namely the Philippines, Indonesia, Bangladesh, and Nepal. So last week, we looked at the roots of the debt problem of southern countries, how colonization led to unjust, unequal economic and political relations across countries, including financial relations and transactions, such as in lending and borrowing. Now, for this session, we will have a deeper discussion of the debt problem in Asia, starting from the 70s to the 80s and onwards, the conditionalities and the lasting impacts of the debt problem, as well as the various debt relief schemes and the complicity of Southern governments. So to give us a deeper dive on the debt problem in Asia, we have a longtime debt justice activist. We all know her, or most of us know her. She's the coordinator of the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, Lidi Nakpil. Lidi, you have 20 minutes for your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, hello and good afternoon, everyone. I think there's been a mix-up. I'm supposed to give the history of the debt problem. I think my assignment is to give the historical overview of the debt problem, and it will be May who will give us a deeper dive into the Asia landscape on the debt. So I prepared some slides to give you that history, that background, and so I'm just going to share my screen right now. Let me see, screen share. Okay, can everyone see the screen now? I think it's very important to have a deeper dive into the history. We touched a little bit on it in the webinar last week. We're going to just go into a little bit deeper. Very important to have that overview of that history. Now, we've said that the debt problem is a legacy of our history of colonialism for many southern countries. But don't worry, I'm not going to go back as far as the history of colonialism, but just at least to begin with the period when there was a huge ballooning or huge increase of the debts of southern countries. What were the events leading to this and what happened since then? So I'm going to start sometime in the late 60s to the 1970s. So this is going to take you through these different periods and what were the major developments in these different periods. From the late 60s to the 70s, this was a period of heavy international lending by public and private lending institutions. So consequently, of course, corollarily, or on the other hand, you can say it's a period of heavy borrowing from borrowing by southern countries, many of them in Asia, but of course also many in Africa and Latin America, from these institutions, public and private. The lending, of course, was being driven by several things. The lending coming from international lending coming from public and private sources. One was, it was a period where there was a lot of push for exports and trade from north to south. There was also a lot of finance capital surplus. So they wanted to invest this surplus in new markets abroad. There was a lot of heavy investment already of finance capital in the north. So the south represented a huge area for markets for finance capital. And then lending as part of foreign policy to support favored regimes. During this period, you will see that the period of the 60s to 70s, there was a lot of authoritarian regimes in Asia, in Africa, and Latin America that were allies of major powers, especially the US, and lending was a way of propping up these regimes and providing support for these regimes. So consequently, in the 60s to the 70s, this was a period of enormous, dramatic growth of external debt stock of many southern countries. As we moved later into the 70s, there were also a confluence of major events. So you already had this ballooning debts, huge increase in debts. And then there was a confluence of events later into the 70s, which included a fall in the prices of exports of many southern countries, earning less dollars and less for other foreign currencies. There was a sharp increase in the price of oil. No? So you can go deeper into the history of this oil price wars in the 70s, no? which many countries were importing, many countries in the South. And thus, while you had less earnings in dollars, you also had higher demand for dollars because oil was being purchased in dollars and other foreign currencies. And then there was an increase in the exchange rate from US dollars to domestic currencies of southern economies. So there's, in other words, a devaluation of many currencies in the South, which became much more expensive. So the dollar became much more expensive in terms of local currencies. Okay. So you had a situation where there was an increase in the external debt stock because there was a lot of pushing of loans from the north to the south. And then you have this confluence of factors which led to a very unstable world economic as well as economic situation of countries in the south. And then this led to a situation by the late 70s to the early 70s where there is a higher cost of debt service, higher volume of debt service, but also a higher cost of debt service. There was an increase in external debt stock because it was denominated in dollars. So even if you don't borrow more, your debt stock was increasing in relation to the value of your domestic currency. There was difficulties in meeting debt payments, and therefore, there was a heavy reduction of flows from private lending. So these are major developments that unfolded from the late 60s to the 70s, leading to what is now being called as the first global debt crisis. This was in the early 80s. Because as we commented last week, the debt crisis, a term used by lenders to mean when borrowers are having difficulties in meeting their debt payments. So there's a debt crisis from the point of view of lenders because of all these developments, which led to a situation in huge difficulties on the part of borrowers to meet their debt payments. There is something here that I forgot to add, which is also very significant. No? When heavy borrowing started in the late 60s to the early 70s, a lot of the loans were based on what is called floating interest rates, not fixed interest rates. So interest rates were dependent on what was the market interest rates. So by the late 70s to the early 80s, suddenly interest rates also increased. Market interest rates also increased. Why the increase? No. So it's like a cycle where there is difficulty in meeting payments, and because there's a lot of risk to lending, the interest rates, the market interest rates of lending increased, and therefore the interest rates of outstanding loans, because even if you borrowed from an earlier period when the market rates were low, because they were borrowed on the basis of floating rates, then whatever was the prevailing market rates at that time would be the interest that you would have to pay on your debts. Okay. So this also led to a situation where there was huge lending from multilateral public institutions, the World Bank especially, that were tied, and the IMF, no, that were tied with conditionalities. No? Because now it was very, not that conditionalities were only invented in the 80s, but now there were so many conditionalities tied with the intention to make sure, number one, that Southern economies continue to be able to pay their debts. Number two, they prescribe policies that were meant to nurse back these economies into a situation of macroeconomic health, and eventually a situation where they can pursue growth. No, so this is the period of the first packages of structural adjustment programs from the World Bank and packages of austerity measures from the IMF, the early 80s. No? We hear about those austerity packages till this day. So the IMF has not changed its basic approach. On the other hand, on the part of the World Bank, they no longer call it structural adjustment policies. They call it something else, but it's still basically the same policies that come with lending from these multilateral institutions. So these policies were austerity packages, you know, tight fiscal and monetary policies. What do they mean by that? When you say tight fiscal and monetary policies, the IMF imposed conditions like if you were incurring deficits in your budget, you're only allowed to incur a certain minimum maximum deficit. So at the time, for instance, 2% deficit in your budget was the absolute maximum. Tight monetary policies means in order to supposedly counter inflation, you were only allowed to keep interest rates very low. And so these were the usual packages that came with IMF lending. So there were also other austerity packages like limits to particular budget items, the removal of subsidy supports for, say, agriculture and so on. So there was a lot of content. We can spend a lot of time reviewing what these are, but this will also ring true for many of the policies being prescribed, no longer discussed, no longer presented as structural adjustment, but are being prescribed still today. Then also for some countries they started with the neoliberal policies of privatization, deregulation, and liberalization. So this came in waves. I think the Latin American countries were made to go through this first. The Philippines followed later. No? So this was how it unfolded from the late 60s to the 1980s. So one of the most important signal of the global debt crisis was, you will go through the literature, is the Mexico default. You know, the first time that a major economy like Mexico started defaulting on its loans. And this was followed by defaults of many countries as well, including the Philippines went into default. I think that was in 1984. So the story doesn't end there. So from the late 1980s to the 1990s, what followed were also other very important milestones that will explain why we have this landscape that we have today. One milestone is the securitization of debts. What does this mean, securitization of debts? Securitization has to do with the issuance of sovereign securities or bonds. Sovereign meaning publicly issued, not private bonds. The issuance of sovereign securities, so governments, borrowing governments, started to issue securities. When you say you issue securities, you say, well, these are our security papers, you can come and buy them. So it's a form of borrowing, or you can say bonds, no? So it's these terms are interchangeable. And so they borrow money by selling basically papers and say, the papers will say, we are borrowing this amount and we will pay this amount, which includes the interest on the securities. The significance of this is it's termed securitization of debts because they were having difficulty paying existing debt. They started selling bonds and securities to pay existing debt. Yeah. So this means you're transforming more or less traditional debts that you borrow from multilaterals, from financial institutions, from banks, into debts that you will now owe from the financial capital markets. So one of the major securitization deals that, for instance, the Philippines and many other countries went through is called the Brady bonds. So look that up. I'm not going to go into the detail about Brady bonds, but I just want to cite this as an example of a major effort to securitize debts, to issue securities, to borrow from the financial markets in order to retire existing debts. So this is how, for instance, in the Philippine case, many of the dictatorship debts were eventually paid by issuing securities and borrowing new money in order to pay the dictatorship loan. So in the end, you still have debts. Yeah, so it's just that you don't owe them to the same sources. It's different when you issue bonds and securities to earn money or to borrow money to pay for something else, like a project. No, you issue bonds or securities to pay for a project. In this case, especially in the 90s, there was a huge wave of issuance of securities just to retire existing debt. Okay. There's also the phenomenon of resorting to domestic borrowings. So when governments were finding it difficult now to borrow on external debt from external sources, they started inwardly borrowing from domestic sources by issuing treasury bonds and treasury bills. So there was a huge issuance of treasury bonds and treasury bills in different parts of history. The Philippines was one of the early ones to do that. So as a result, from the 80s to the 90s and till today, there was a big increase in domestic debt, so that for many countries today, especially for middle-income countries, what you have is a situation of big external debt plus big domestic debt. In some cases, the domestic debt is even bigger than the external debt. And when you say the debt problem, we're not only dealing with the external debt here, we're also dealing with domestic debt. Now, domestic debts are domestic debt because they're issued inside the country in terms of bonds and securities, but it also does not guarantee that the holder of these domestic bonds and securities are all domestic capital or institutions. They can also be international institutions that bought treasury bonds and treasury bills. A case in point, for instance, China actually is the holder of many US treasury bonds. Yeah, but because they are US treasury bonds, they are classified under the domestic debt of the US, not under the external debt. Okay. There's also this phenomenon that grew a lot in the 80s and the 90s, especially in the advent of privatization, where governments started issuing public guarantees for private sector debt. Now, this is very important because eventually when the private sector could not pay their debts, the public sector or government started assuming these private liabilities. So the public guarantees come in different forms. Okay. When it's not yet assumed, they are classified as contingent liabilities. When they are already assumed, or inherited, they are transformed from being contingent liabilities into outstanding debt. So they're now debt. They're not just liabilities contingent on something. The contingency already happened, so they become debt. So this is also an important phenomenon to take note, and we deal with this even today as we look at the different public guarantees extended to the private sector in processes of privatization and in transactions under public-private partnerships. So this is one thing to watch out for as well. Then, of course, multilateral lending continued with conditionalities, and especially by the 90s, a heavy emphasis on privatization, deregulation, and liberalization. So it was no longer primarily to nurse back into health the macroeconomy and fiscal situation, which they meant, lenders meant nursing back to health is you're now able to pay back your debts. They were now using these conditionalities in order to restructure domestic economies to make them closer to the neoliberal design. Yeah, open markets, free markets, where there are no restriction, border restrictions on the free movement of capital and goods. And then also the takeover by the private sector, even of public services and enterprises. So moving again through the 90s, now we're going to pay attention to the major developments in debt relief schemes. Okay. So the global debt crisis in the 80s brought about a lot of restructuring, the securitization as a way of addressing, so more lending to address the big debt payment problem. In the 90s, when a second wave of debt crisis, and this time it's another set of countries that were into quote unquote debt crisis. The first time it was a lot of economies in Latin America and Philippines, those considered emerging market economies, those who could borrow from the private sector and so on, were the ones who went through that wave. In the 90s, the wave of debt crisis were primarily among those identified as low income and highly indebted. And the debt crisis of these countries were not so much of the commercial and short-term loans, but loans that involved bilateral and multilateral debt. So the creditors or the lenders launched this initiative for debt relief called the Highly Indebted Poor Country Debt Relief Initiative. In 1996, it was called still HIPIC. In 1999, they said it's now called the Enhanced HIPIC because they improved, they supposedly, quote unquote, improved. And this Highly Indebted Poor Country Initiative only involved a few set of countries. Sounds familiar, no? Look at the current debt relief that we have now. Just a small set of countries, and we're only focusing on bilateral debt. No? And this debt relief came with conditionalities. The debt relief that was aimed for these countries were those whose debts they were not able to pay their debts anymore. They were actually not paying their debts anymore because they were that burdened with these debts. So the not so secret intention of HIPIC was to nurse back these countries into a situation where they can pay their debts and that they can borrow some more. When we were critiquing HIPIC at that time, I happened to be in a panel with an IMF spokesperson who was quite, I don't think he realized what he was quite brazen, and I don't think he realized how ridiculous and how he was exposing himself. He was saying, HIPIC is intended to help these countries so they can start borrowing again, especially from the financial markets. So you can usher in new lenders so that they can access more loans. No? So they were quite brazen with this agenda. We also called it an exercise of cleaning the books. No, what do you mean when you're cleaning the books? You want your books to look good so that you will be credit worthy again. You don't want to look like you're somebody who has a lot of loans. So if you're going to cancel these loans or these debts, then your books will look good. Yeah. So that will enable you to borrow from other sources. At the same time, there was a huge effort internationally called the Jubilee 2000 campaign, which started, I think, in a little before 1998. The first big meeting they organized was in 1998. And that campaign was calling for the cancellation of the unpayable debts of the poorest countries. So this was a campaign that really drumbeat the call for debt cancellation. But we happen to have a disagreement with that particular call because, first of all, it was only focusing on the poorest countries. It was not focusing for all of the South. So also sounds familiar today, you know, who are the poorest? Only the poor are only the poorest the ones that deserve the debt cancellation based on justice and based on need, no? And then they were calling for cancellation of the unpayable debts. And at that time, the definition of unpayable debts was that it was hard to collect. They could not pay. Unpayable, could not. No? So as movements from the South, we launched a movement alongside with Jubilee 2000 called the Jubilee South to say that this message is at best inadequate, if not wrong. And we were saying, first of all, it should be all debts of the South that should be considered, all countries of the South. And because not only are debts unpayable, but debts are also illegitimate. No? So the whole discourse of illegitimacy of debt and illegitimate debts was ushered in by our movements when we founded Jubilee South. So more on that in another webinar perhaps, but this is very important in terms of sharpening our own perspectives as Southern movements on the question of debt and debt cancellation and debt justice. Moving on to the 2000s, so eventually Jubilee South was able to convince other movements in the South and in the North that we don't just deal with unsustainable debt, we also have to deal with illegitimate debt. So in 2005, 2006, we collectively launched an international campaigning on illegitimate debt and calling for debt cancellation plus, because debt cancellation is an act of lenders, no? We were also calling for debt repudiation by Southern governments and by the South. So this is 2005, 2006. Alongside this development, we also saw another wave of debt relief initiatives from lenders, and this is the MDRI. What is the MDRI? Sorry, I think we advanced in that slide. MDRI is the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative. And this time it's like HIPIC, but HIPIC was dealing with bilateral debt. This one, it was dealing with multilateral debt. So another round of debt relief for basically a similar set of countries or nearly the same set of countries. And after HIPIC and then MDRI, there comes this kind of international claim or discourse by governments and lending institutions that the debt problem of the South has largely been solved after HIPIC and MDRI. So we were saying that that's not true. No? HIPIC and MDRI did not solve the debt problem of the South. So following that, came the financial and economic crisis in 2008, you know, the unraveling of the international financial system. And there emerged also the phenomenon of the Eurozone debt crisis. The debt crisis was no longer a crisis of the South. Several northern countries were also going through a similar debt crisis. So this is an important phenomenon, not just as the South, just as they were claiming, lenders were claiming that the South debt problem has largely been solved. Here comes huge debt problems in the North, no? And there are a number of dramatic examples like Greece, like Ireland, like Portugal, and other places. Now at this point, there's also another term that became frequently used. So it's no longer just simply about debt crisis. They're also talking about debt distress, this period just before you go into a crisis. And this started already in the late 2000, before 2010, when those who went through HIPIC and MDRI started going into debt distress, proving our point earlier. Because what happened? So they were rehabilitated through this debt relief, they started borrowing again, which was the intention of the lenders by giving this debt relief. And so there was a reaccumulation of debt, by these countries. And then there were other countries who did not receive this debt relief, but also started exhibiting signs of debt distress. I should have put that in quotes. And it's important to note that, again, debt distress, debt crisis, as they are currently used in the mainstream discourse, are concepts defined by lenders. No? Debt crisis, when you're not able to pay on time and adequately your debt payments. Debt distress is when you're threatened. You're threatened and you have high risks of going into crisis. Okay, so this is now what is actually being used in this whole discourse now that we're in the midst of a multiple crisis of the COVID pandemic, the economic crisis, and the climate crisis. I'm not going to go further into history because going further is now going to talk about the present, and May will be taking care of that. I just want to point out some things. We need to take a look at what are the drivers of this borrowing and lending on a broader scale, no? So from the banks and private financial institutions and the buyers of bonds and securities, this would be their reasons. No, I'm running out of time. Sorry, Bruce, I'm going past the 20 minutes, but I'm just showing these would be their reasons. From the point of view of public lenders, this would be the reasons from the multilateral, bilateral, and other public financial institutions. And from the borrowing country's point of view, the reasons, and this is how also the public lenders justify it, is poverty, lack of capital, low public revenues, etc., etc. But actually behind this, why is there quote-unquote poverty or quote-unquote lack of capital or quote-unquote low public revenues? There are a number of factors, and I've just raised some of them here. Not going through each point because I'm running out of time. And also down there, in that box down there, is a broader political economy situation where there is complicity, subservience, corruption of governments and elite capture of governments, and also complicit elites, domestic southern elites that are complicit with international elites. And mind you, in some of our countries, sections of our elites belong to the international elites, right? So just this picture is important. Let's look at that. And then finally, my last slide, sorry, Bruce, is just to say that in reality, if they're saying we need capital, that's why they're giving aid, they're sending investments, they're providing loans. In reality, there is a huge, much bigger flow of resources from the south to the north than from what they're sending to us. And that is the reason why we're not able to keep the wealth we generate in our countries. So who's supporting the economies? Who's supporting who? It's our economies that are generating the wealth that flows to the north. So this is through profit repatriation, tax avoidance and evasion, exports of underpriced resources and commodities, debt service, including interest payments, illicit financial flows, payment for costly imports, underpaid labor, etc. And if you compare that, that's many times more than whatever aid or investments or loans is being sent to our countries. And that can be empirically proven by research and by data. So I'd like to end there, and I hope that provides a historical and broader political economy context to the state of Asia's debt today, which will be discussed by our next speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Lydie. Don't worry, we understand that you're also sick and recovering. So thank you so much for your very rich presentation. Indeed, it's we need to look at the debt problem from its historical and political economic. And we see from your presentation that there are key waves in the debt problem in Asia, and the period of heavy borrowing started in the 60s and 70s. But it's also striking that this heavy borrowing coincided with also with the uh, uh, authoritarian regimes. So international financial institutions lent to these regimes. So now we go on to the next segment of this webinar where we look at the country debt landscape. So we go deeper and by highlighting the public debt profiles and that debt justice issues at the country level. So we're going to look at first Bangladesh, then Nepal, followed by the Philippines, and lastly Indonesia. So we just decided to switch it up a bit. So Equity and Justice Working Group, better known as Equity BD, is an alliance of several NGOs, CSOs, and individual activists in Bangladesh. It works on a range of issues that cover, among others, trade and economic justice, human rights, and climate change. Equity BD is also a member of the Bangladesh Working Group on External Debt, which is a national forum advocating for the rights of communities adversely affected by loan-funded projects of international financial institutions. So here to present about debt justice issues in Bangladesh is Mohammed Asanul Karim, or Asanul. Asanul, you have 15 minutes for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce, and Lydia and other participants. So I'm Asanul Karim, working in Equity as a coordinator, policy research and campaign for trade justice in Bangladesh. And you know that Equity is the program component of Post Foundation. Post Foundation is our mother organization. Thank you, Bruce, that you have rightly said about the functions and the mission of the Equity. First thing I like to hear from you that are you listening me properly?
Yes,
Yes.
we can.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. So let me start. I'm going just trying to highlight the debt situation and the COVID issues effect in Bangladesh. The global health crisis caused by COVID-19 hit Bangladesh economy hard and jeopardized the country's achievements in poverty reduction. Around 36 million people lost their jobs, 16.5 million fell into poverty, and 95% of population has faced a serious income dropout due to COVID crisis. As a result of the pandemic, the number of poor people in Bangladesh is set to double from 32 to 64 million, affecting 41% of the population. Our present population is about 170 million in Bangladesh. So our economy stands to lose a staggering $13.5 billion for the coronavirus outbreaks, which is almost 5% of the country's GDP, according to Asia Development Bank. Bangladesh entered the crisis with a relatively low level of public debt of 35.8% of GDP and projected to increase into 42.3% GDP by 2023. External debt in Bangladesh is expected to reach $45 billion by the end of 2021. Almost 63% government revenues are required for adjusting this debt service. I mean, this is for repayment. As a result, almost the entire public revenue will be required to meet debt service payment. Study found that currently, for each US dollar paid to creditors as debt service, Bangladesh can only afford to invest 0.41 cents on public education and healthcare. Since independence in 1971 till June 2020, foreign borrowing ran into $68 billion, of which the government repaid $34 billion so far. The government aims to borrow more $8.5 billion from the external sources to implement its aid-on development program in in the upcoming fiscal in the current fiscal year. Against this backdrop, the international community has failed to provide substantial support to Bangladesh. The G20 Debt Service Suspension Initiative (DSSI) allows for the suspension of debt service owed to bilateral creditors between April 2020 and June 2021. The Bangladesh government had an option to reduce the debt burden by at least $20 million by June 2021 under this DSSI of G20 countries. But this is unfortunate that Bangladesh government has decided not to enjoy this privilege. Government should have utilized the facilities during this crisis, as export may not look up anytime soon, and remittance will drop out due to the global impact of the novel coronavirus. After getting the independence in 1971, the aid and debt ratio that time was aid was 90% and the debt was 10%. And at present, end of June 2021, if we see, the aid is 3%, debt is 90%. So the scenario is saying that how drastically the debt has increased and the aid has been decreased. End of June 2021, the total debt balance is about $171 billion, which is almost 47% of total GDP. Our present GDP is $364 billion. And it has been increased 70% by 6 months, considering the June 2020, and from considering the July 2019, and it has been increased 19%. As a result, debt burden is increasing, and per capita debt present is about $750, which is 30% increase than the year 2019, and 170% has increased considering the year 2010. For the new year, for this new year, government has passed the budget of $71 billion, with where the deficit budget is about $25 billion. And this amount will be collected as loan from domestic and external sources. Due to COVID pandemic, government is never been achieved to collect the revenue as per a target set for 2020 and 2021. Average achievement was 53% due to COVID crisis because of income erosion by the people, especially business and other activities as well fall down due to pandemic lockdown for the several months. And that's why government is heavily depending on the loans and indirect tax, especially VAT, as easy tools of revenue mobilization. In the year 2021, government has paid interest about $7.5 billion, which is 9% higher than the last year, and 20%, which is also the 20% of total revenue. Now the question is, where this debt money is going? Mostly going to the mega projects like the multi-purpose bridge, which is about 5 kilometers long, and constructing different highways, different coal-based projects, electricity power, and for non-development expenditure like salary and other benefits for the government staff and the defense and other security forces. The matter of fact that these are the highly secure and appropriate place for the corruption. Government has declared stimulus package of about $8 billion for the COVID-19. 80% of this amount has been occupied by the businessmen, especially by the government owners and their locals, mostly at the urban level. They did not provide proper treatment for their lower level staff and even not paid the wages and the salary properly to them. They have just eaten the money. SME, small and medium entrepreneurs at the rural level has been collapsed because of this stimulus package did not go to the sub-district and rural level. Apart from this, default loans are increasing due to not refunding to the banks, especially by the elite robber barons who are mostly patronized by the governments. They have plundered about $3.53 billion from different banks in different periods. End of 2020, the deferred loans balance at now $11.5 billion, which is increased about 329% than the year 2011. During the year 2011, it was $2.6 billion. Now it is $11.5 billion. So the figure says how it has been increased. Building infrastructure in Bangladesh is costliest in the world. If we see the Potra multimodal piece, the cost was estimated first in 2011, and the cost was $1.43 billion, which is now $3.5 billion. So total increase is 149%. If we look at the different highway road construction, the per kilometer road construction cost is the highest in the world in the Bangladesh, which is about $3.5 million to $12 million per kilo in Bangladesh, and so it is very high compared to other countries like India. This is $1.4 million to $1.3 million. In China, this is 1.3 to $1.6 million, and for Europe, this is $2.5 million to $3.5 million. Whereas in Bangladesh, this is $3.5 million to $12 million. So this is the very bad scenario in here. Why these projects are not finished in due time? Because of corruption and uninvested money. These are the major issues. Because the government never can close these projects in due time, every year they extend these projects. So these are the things, these are the issues. And the effect is that the World Ultra Wealth Report 2018 by World Bank said Bangladesh is ranked the fastest growing country for increasing number of rich people in the world. The number of ultra high net worth individuals in Bangladesh rose by 17.5% from 2012 to 2017. In China, this is 13.4%, which is next to Bangladesh. In Vietnam, this is 12.7%. In Kenya, this is 11%. In India, this is 10%. On the other hand, as a part of public service, the total education budget for the year 2021 was 12%, and total budget 20% of total budget and 2% of GDP. And for health, it is 5% of total budget and less than 0.94% of total GDP. So very bad, and this is a very upset scenario for here. Government is not giving emphasis to this area. The health service condition is very bad in Bangladesh. The COVID-19 showed us the real picture of health condition in Bangladesh. Lack of hospital and its management, lack of corruption and cooperation, lack of oxygen and bed. At present, we have 0.8 bed. It means less than 1 bed per 100,000 people. Lack of doctors. At present, we have 0.4 physicians per 100,000 people. Infrastructure, lack of infrastructure, shortage of vaccine. We have at present 12 doses for every 1,000 people. So total population is 170 million, as I said earlier. Lack of monitoring on COVID tests in different private hospitals, etc. The government has increased the budget for COVID, but these are mostly using for the vaccine purchase and for other supporting costs. We found in different newspapers that plenty of corruptions have been happening in terms of vaccine purchase for different countries, from different countries. The terms and conditions and settling vaccine cost is not transparent and public. A senior female journalist of a country lead newspaper wanted to investigate about this process of the purchase, but unfortunately she could not. She was harassed a lot by the government, other departments, and even by the police. She was jailed almost 10 days here for this purpose without any specific reason. Now, how can we reduce this debt service? We have to arresting illicit financial flows for earning more revenue mobilizations. which is yearly average illicit emissions for Bangladesh is $7.5 billion. Increasing direct tax instead of indirect tax as part at present, the direct and indirect tax ratio is 35% is direct tax and 65% is indirect tax. So it needs to increase tax net. At present, only 2% of total population are giving tax, which is very little. Companies not giving emphasis for tackling tax for rich and rich people rather than increasing indirect tax as like that, which is hampering the livelihood of the poor and marginalized people. Needs to ensure fair share of tax by the multinational companies and the rich for revenue mobilization for lightening burdens of indirect tax on the poor and the general people. Taking punitive measures against bank looters who are always patronized by the government and other influentials, arresting underground economy, which is average 55% of total GDP. I mean, at present it is about 150 to 190 billion dollar, the black money or underground economy, what you're saying. More budget allocation for public service, especially for health, education, water and sanitation. Stop corruption and ensure transparency for all sources of expenditure, including capital purchase at all levels. Stop government's unnecessary expenses and reduce non-development expenses rather than increase development expenses. So we have a very scope. We have if this so it gives a strong political wins for the government for ensuring or tackling on these issues. And if government give emphasis and be serious, then it is very easy to collect more revenues from these sectors and to reduce the debt burden both for external and internal. So this is the situation, Bangladesh. Thank you very much for my part.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Asanul. We see from your presentation how the debt problem in Bangladesh started also in the 1960s, and that the current situation, the current COVID crisis in Bangladesh right now is very much tied to conditionalities of the IFIs, which include the deprioritization of public and health services. So it's more the priority of debt service over public service. So thank you very much. We now go to another South Asian country, looking at the debt problem, debt problem of Nepal. From Nepal, we have with us a longtime activist leader from the All Nepal Peasants Federation, the largest alliance of peasants in Nepal, which has been fighting against feudalism, imperialism, and neoliberalism since its inception in 1951. Its 23 national level producers organizations continue to be active in mobilizing actions for democratic freedom, peasants' rights, land reforms, food sovereignty, and climate justice. It also staunchly resisted loan projects of the Asian Development Bank, as well as the World Bank, such as the big dams and water privatization. Please give a warm welcome to Professor Keshab Raj Kadka. Professor Keshab, you have 15 minutes for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce and Lady and all friends. And especially thanks to you for nice introduction of my organization, and very much happy to be with you as a part of this debt cancellation or debt movement. Yeah, as our friend Bruce introduced me, we were together with Lady, I think, for quite a long time, more than decades. I simply can remember first seeing her personally in very close contact in Bali 2007 when there was a climate event, and then or sometimes earlier before that, I think in same country, Indonesia, in 2004 when Walden Bilo was there to address things regarding our movement and all those things, but not so recognizingly. In 2007, we were there, and from 2010, I am very much part of this movement, Jubilee South onwards and all those things. So with this long association, actually, we should owe, we Nepal, we generally talk, we owe to LEDI to introduce this debt crisis things from people's side and from civil society organizations like RRN and many other friends. I should not name all those organizations, which are more than 26 with us. So this civil movement, it was actually started by LEDI's initiation. So thanks once again. So let me go into the problem. Now, I will update from just this beginning. In this year or every year, we start our fiscal year at the month of June. So last June, our national budget of 16 trillion rupees was there presented, and of which I think trillion rupees, it is Nepalese rupees, and at the rate of 120 per dollar. So almost 100 times we generally caught 2 zeros so that it is easy to calculate. So there, foreign debt. And you know that the as of this budget time, like last June, our total foreign debt reaches 1.80 trillion, and which is almost 40%, 42%, I think, of national GDP. So economists now always argue, which I have to always oppose, you know, that we are still in safe limit, because in many countries and World Bank and IMF and all these other financial international authorities, they suggest 60% up to that foreign debt is still manageable. And once we had reached that point also, in 2002, I think, when there was Maoist crisis and 10 years armed struggle, and it was at the last concluding years or something like that. In that it has already reached there. So at that time, our foreign debt had massively increased, and it was recorded at 63.4% of GDP, I think, at that time. So the people say that it is Canada, but we in general, we always criticize it, not because of that, what you call that mainstream economic point of view, but because of its significance and our precarious economic position, national economy, and all those things. Because Nepal is a country of long history, and it manages to finance its what you call that any event, national crisis on its own. You know, we had 2 years war against British imperialism in 1814-16, and where we had to a teeny country, Himalayan country. At that time, it was only, I think, the population was less than 50 million, and still with that great empire, we fought for 2 years without any single penny of help from outside, and we managed it on our own. And in 1934, when there was a great, earthquake, and the whole Kathmandu was, massacred, and all those things were there. And certainly at that time, the Emperor of Japan, he tried sincerely to help this country. And the king at that time said that, oh, thank you, but it is our pride that we can manage our own things. And he did not take even grant. So, and this legacy was up to 1980 for your remembrance, because at that time there was a great debate whether we should take debt or not. Till that time, from 50s, we were getting only aids, grants, not loan. So should Nepal advance on loan or not? So that legacy reminds us that when, it was very awkward to say that in 1990, when there was this so-called revolution and democracy restoration, which all enjoyed also, because we were getting the revenge from that dictatorship. So, but at that time, it stands only at 3 billion rupees, not US dollar. In a US dollar, it was almost exchange at that time. It was limited in less than a few $1 million. So from that experience, when we were in 1990s, the elected government was from right, and they advocated this loan embarking, I should say, policy of liberalization, and it went on so much high, that in 2015, and I have taken this as a referential year, because that we had great that earthquake on that 25th April of 2015 of 7.8 Richter scale that took away more than 8,000 lives and several hundred million, 100,000 homes of people. So at that time, it was only 544.9 billion Nepalese rupees as a that loan, foreign loan. But it tripled now, within 5 years, it tripled to 1.80 million, 1.8 trillion, I should say, $1 trillion. So, and the rate of GDP growth, it is almost not matching that thing. Because if we have taken so much massive loan, then it must have a productive impact on GDP growth and social justice. Let leave alone this economic and social justice matters. Even measuring by GDP, it is simply 3.45 trillion now. So it is not even doubled. GDP is not even doubled, and to double it, it will take till 2024. But at that time, judging at the rate of this increasing trend of foreign debt in this 5 years, 5 years, it will be already 2.28 trillion debt. So that means we are increasing by leaps and bounds. And this year's budget says that 2 trillion Nepalese rupees. That is almost 200 billion US dollar. That is the amount of debt, service as told in the budget of this year, 2021-22. So already we are spending spending so much, and as my dear friend Asanul said from Bangladesh, that the impact of COVID. So just I will give example that we need simply $2 billion, not 200 billion, and then just 2 billion for vaccines for all Nepalese people at the rate of $4 for each hour. So how the money is drained in that sector, it has been always a concern with us. And fortunately, I should remind you that day before, not on Sunday, yes, on Sunday, we were interacting with parliamentarians, especially with the chairman of the Economic Commission of Parliament, Economic and Financial Commission of this Parliament, Mr. Krishna Dahalji, honorable member of House and chairman of that parliamentary committee. And we were reminding him all these things and how we should go ahead. Because it will take really into a crisis, debt management crisis in near future. Though the die-hard economists from government side and from National Planning Commission, they always advocate on this debt issues. So we are a kind of already struggle, struggle against this trend. And besides, we are raising the point that this year's, that report from Financial Controller General, just like in every country, there is the award of that government body. And it warns the government that more than 12 trillion Nepalese rupees amounted as calculated in the report as non-compliance with government rules expenditures. So there are too much high cases of embezzlement, financial embezzlement, a treason against the nation. So we are not. It is simply every year this government authority it gives the reports and no progress has been no progress has been recorded. So the malpractices of the government projects and this functioning of the government and the effectiveness of utilization has gone very at low, very low level. So we are raising the point that if the government is to take loans, then that must be properly utilized and it must have direct impact on GDP. If you cannot take the ratio of this debt growth and GDP growth, then you have no right to take further loans, simply to manage the things. Just like this year, this budget depends more than 3 trillion rupees amount of foreign aid. And that is almost in development expenditures. That means if you cannot get those foreign commitments, as it always happens, in our experience, it is less than 20% of the total commitment comes. So that means your development activities or the capital formation or capital expenditure is almost cut down. Because you are always at the mercy of the foreign loaners or financial international agencies to put your things. So, and they are, pressing. In the same that Financial Controller General's report, they say that there is some kind of dishonesty with the government because the unnecessarily high interest rate paid loans are taken, not justified on the national ground. So it has been also because if alternatives were there, and especially that was from 3 agencies, that is now increasingly from Asian Development Bank, World Bank, and IMF, they are always. So these trends, though economically still manageable, as the mainstream economics say, we always advocate, that it is a vice against the state, against the nation, to take more and more, loans and without any productivity. So I think it is almost 15 minutes. Bruce is seeing this and that side to warn me. So thank you for this year. I will stop, and I will like to again express my thanks from both organizations, Tax and Fiscal Justice Alliance Nepal, where UNFA is also a member by virtue of being a member of the head of research department of UNFA. I am there in Takya. So there's 2 organizations, UNFA, All Nepal Peasant Federation, which Bruce had very nicely introduced. Thank you so much. So thanks to all for hearing my few words, and good afternoon and namaste from Nepal. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Professor Kashab. You raised the issue of debt manageability in Nepal. So in the language of the international financial institutions, they actually use the term debt sustainability, which is basically the ability of countries to repay their loans. But we see that this perspective is disregards the impact of the debt on poor people, on the people, which includes, for example, the violation of the right to food and livelihood, whereby peasants, for example, are unable to feed themselves. You also mentioned, you rightly mentioned the malfunctioning of the government in Nepal. So thank you very much for your presentation. From South Asia, we now go to Southeast Asia. First with the Philippines and then later with Nepal. With the Indonesia, sorry. The Freedom from Debt Coalition, Philippines, FPC, leads one of the longest running debt campaigns in the world. Its members include organizations of workers, farmers, students and youth, urban poor, and women, among others. Together, they continue to develop alternatives for people-centered and sustainable development and fight against neoliberal economic policies that include loan conditionalities for the privatization of essential services, as well as other austerity measures. So I was part of FDC once but here to present a closer look at the Philippines debt profile is the program officer for essential services, Rovic Obanil. Rovic, you have 15 minutes for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you again for giving us this opportunity to discuss the Philippine situation. I have a PowerPoint presentation. Can everyone see it?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
So the title of my presentation is From Revival to Reversal. And I think this captures the essence of my presentation, because for some time now, our government has been trumpeting the so-called revival of the Philippines from being the so-called sick man of Asia to one of the best performers in the region. But of course, we have seen in recent months that this has effectively been reversed. So yeah, like I said, our economic managers in the Philippines have been busy trumpeting or thumping their chests and saying that the Philippines is strong and it's about to take off. And they based this on a couple of what they call macroeconomic fundamentals. For example, the average 6.6% GDP growth rate in recent years, and the 39.6% debt to GDP ratio, which is supposedly the lowest on record. The positive credit rating, the BBB plus credit rating, which is the highest in the country's history. And even the revenue effort has been very positive. It's the highest since 1997. But of course, we know that many of these so-called strong macroeconomic fundamentals have seen a reversal. So in fact, only recently, the New York-based Fitch Ratings revised the outlook for the Philippines from stable to negative, basically changing. They also changed the growth forecast from 6.3% to 5% due to lingering impacts of the pandemic-induced recession. And this is a big deal because the last time the Philippines received a negative outlook from credit rating agencies was way back in 2005 when Fitch, Moody's, Standard & Poor downgraded the country's rating due to growing political unrest. At the time, there were big rallies in the capital and all over the Philippines to try to oust the sitting President Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo. And the downgrade is in fact a huge setback for the current administration, which has been harping on the so-called positive credit ratings. And this comes, of course, after our economy contracted by 4.2% in the first quarter of this year, when the expectation was that it was going to bounce back from negative in the previous year. And there's more bad news because while the poverty incidence went down to 16.7% in 2018, as compared to 23.5% in 2015, we have seen a reversal during the time of the pandemic. In fact, data from the ADB says that poverty incidence was likely around 20% in 2020, last year. And this means about 22 million poor Filipinos, or an increase of 5.3 million if you compare it to the 17.7 million recorded in 2018. And the latest figures place our unemployment rate at 8.7%. And although this is an improvement, a big improvement from the high of 17.6% in April 2020, it is actually still above the pre-pandemic target of only about 3% or 5% unemployment rate. And it represents 4.4 million Filipino workers without jobs. And actually, this is nothing new to ordinary Filipinos, because all they have to do is step out of their houses into the streets and they see all of these homeless and jobless Filipinos. Of course, a big part of the blame is the bungled response, COVID-19 response of the government, because despite claims by the administration, the current administration, actually we failed to promptly respond to the unfolding crisis. In fact, as late as February 2020, our president was basically downplaying the problem saying there's nothing to be scared of. And although our government imposed harsh militaristic lockdowns, there was no immediate effort to boost our health system's capacity respond to the pandemic. And so despite the claims of the government, we failed to respond promptly to the crisis. And not surprisingly, a few months later, we saw a steep rise in cases in the Philippines. And although our Congress authorized funds to deal with the problem, with the crisis, to the tune of about 82.5 billion pesos, or that's about $1.65 billion for the purchase, for example, of vaccines, only a fraction of it was actually readily available. And the bulk of it was in unprogrammed or unbudgeted funds. So we couldn't use them immediately. And as of July this year, only less than 10% or 10 million of our people, our population have had at least one dose of the vaccine, and only about 4% have been fully vaccinated. And this places the Philippines third to the last in the region in the race to reach herd immunity. And in fact, by some estimates, when the report came out, at the rate that we were going, they were saying that it would take the Philippines another 2 years to vaccinate 75% of the population. And so, in fact, if you look at the spending for pandemic response, you will see that we are really trailing our neighbors. So the spending is minuscule compared to many of the countries in Southeast Asia. And as I was saying earlier, we have been saying that the 39.6% debt to GDP ratio was the lowest recorded. But this has already been reversed, and we have seen a spike since. In fact, this was the estimate, for example, 58.1% by 2021, but this has already, we have already breached 60% debt to GDP ratio, and it has started to worry financial managers and even the credit rating agencies and our lenders. So basically, the crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, exposed the problems with the government's narrative of the ever-improving macroeconomic fundamentals of the country. Our national debt stood at only 6.909 trillion, or about $121.8 billion at the end of 2016, when at the start of the current administration of Duterte. As of June this year, the debt had already reached $224 billion, or an increase of 45.62% from the 2016 level. And this unprecedented, this huge surge in debt, $41.2 billion in 2020 alone, calls into question sustainability. And in fact, it could straitjacket succeeding administrations' development efforts, much like what happened after the debt crisis in the 80s. So this graph just shows you the huge surge in borrowing under the current administration. It's also important to remember that the drive to shore up the macroeconomic fundamentals that our economic managers are always keen to extol did not come without pain for Filipinos. In fact, the push to make the Philippines more attractive to investors and lenders was possible largely through the reduction of social expenditures, while also imposing a series of regressive taxes and the low interest, low inflation regime that they are so jealously guarding came at the cost of austerity, additional taxes, and in other words, basically hardship, untold hardship for ordinary Filipinos, particularly the poor, even before the pandemic. And the record-breaking budget deficit of 27.4 billion recorded last year was more than double the previous year's deficit. So it's really a big problem. And to make matters worse, our economic managers led by the Department of Finance, our Economic Development Agency, and our central bank actually used the pandemic as a justification to aggressively push unpopular economic reform measures. So the question now is, are we looking at another development catastrophe in the making? Because the new laws pushed in the midst of the pandemic, which are being packaged as economic recovery legislation aimed at helping the Filipino people through the COVID-19 crisis, are in fact little more than measures aimed at attracting big investors and helping corporations. And you can, this is really, this is in stark contrast to the inadequate support provided for ordinary Filipinos who have been practically left to fend for themselves. And the Filipinos in this webinar know this. And the railroading of this legislative wish list, which includes the Corporate Recovery and Tax Incentives for Enterprises Law, which basically lowered corporate income taxes. It's a big gift for the corporations. Reveals where our government's priorities truly lie. And with our debt spiking, our revenues falling, the budget deficit widening, the Philippines really could be going down the path similar to what we saw in the 1980s. And actually, if you will look at the first slide, it was a mural that we used during one of our activities. And it shows the president holding what is basically a debt, what we call a debt bomb. So the Philippines could be facing a similar situation. And it's a very, very worrying situation for Filipinos. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Rovik. We can see from the presentation how the Philippines may have revived the Philippines and fixed its macroeconomic fundamentals, but I think in doing so, it has also sacrificed the justice fundamentals. So there's a justice deficit in Philippine society. So we still have homeless and jobless, as well as regressive taxation and very low spending on health. And for 2020, COVID-19 response. So thank you very much for your presentation. Now we go to Indonesia. Established in 2002, Koalisi Rakyat Untuk Hak Atas Air, or KRUHA, or in English, the People's Coalition for the Right to Water, has been at the forefront of civil society groups' opposition in Indonesia, particularly against World Bank loan conditions privatizing water. Jakarta's water facility is now back in public hands, a testimony to the power of people's collective and determined struggle. Let's give a warm welcome to the Secretary General of KRUHA, Muhammad Reza, who will share more about the Indonesian people's increasing burdens of debt justice. Reza, you have 15 minutes for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry. I just sent my presentation via WhatsApp to Mai because I have technical problem here. But just to not spending too much time, I think I will start with Lydie already explained about the history of the debt, and I think the title of the this webinar also very nicely worded. The story of water struggle in Indonesia is the story of the debt, and it's still existing up to now. Indonesia has been, borrowing country since the new foundation of the republic. Even to gain its independence, the newly government at that time in 1950 to 1960 process have to pay also the debt of the colonial government, the Dutch colonial government. The figure up to 400 billion, I think, in today calculation. And then in the old regime, we call it old regime, the first government in Indonesia, Indonesia also already, receiving debt, but at that time, some of the significant debt come from the Eastern Bloc, from Soviet at that time. But the loan at that time is, related directly to technical challenge in Indonesia, newly existed country at that time. So it's mostly for building a new road, also dealing with water management issue, and it's different in after financial crisis in Indonesia, and after the political crisis in 1960s in Indonesia, where also I think that was also a reflection of the global political divide between Western Bloc and Eastern Bloc, where the campaign against communism is very strong, pushed by the Western country, and in Indonesia, uh, result led to the situation where million people being killed. They've been accused as a communism, and communism is, something cannot exist in Indonesia. So millions people being killed, uh, and using that political crisis, the World Bank came. I think in 1960s, after this World Bank, IMF is the main promoter of the debt in our part of the world, and after building Europe with Marshall Plan, they start to come to our place, our part of the world, categorizing, putting us in categorizes that they build by their own as less developed country, and in Indonesia, that's I think after the fall of communism in political landscape, the push for development model of economic, which include the very basic pre-qualification, which is the liberalization of everything, the resource, the public resource, including the services, public services. We used to call it the right to natural resource and essential services. So everything is being commodified, including the human, where now we know the term of flexible market flexible labor market flexibility. So that is in line with the how the capital can flow easily, and that is still happening now. And during the new era, the new policy, there's a strong push for development in Indonesia, and including there's a lot of World Bank started, World Bank, IMF, and later on being followed by the ADB, also Islamic Development Bank. That kind of institutions start to coming to Indonesia as a sounds like helper, helping country in the time of difficult. But since new, but they came to change also how the country should operate. I think in my can my presentation can be projected. Okay, and so the cost of development during new era regime in Indonesia, it's about 32 years. Is the a lot of the, I think, precondition for the selling of the public asset in, and that being, the being stronger, the push for that, during the financial crisis in 1990s, where Indonesia again come into the political crisis, but the background of that also a significant background, also financial crisis. So at that time, there's a big mobilization, we call it reformation in Indonesia. So uh, a combination of the economic crisis, monetary crisis at that time, and the strong opposition from the people, uh, brought us to the situation where Suharto uh, left its presidency as a president, and then but the what already being put inside Indonesia, we call it foreign pressure. They are like silently coming to Indonesia. It changed in after financial crisis. They came to Indonesia. The first IMF come Indonesia, came into agreement, letter of intent with Indonesia government, putting money, putting a loan, and with that they also push for uh, financial system liberalization. So we start to change our we start to change our public budget architecture, I think, and start adopting the scam, the mechanism of, where debt, they call it, what they call it, balance budget. So the that used to be in the old regime in Indonesia, used to be considered as the income revenue, like that, and changed after the economic crisis with the LOI with the World Bank. Lady mentioned that at structural adjustment program. So at that time, uh, both IMF and the World Bank is still very much bullish. They force the country, they force the government, because the the crisis that being facing by the country, uh, and we start changing our account mechanism, public account mechanism, where that used to be in the revenue sector, now become spend sector. And by now, Indonesia, and after that, the World Bank came into Indonesia, I think it's in 2000s, uh, and came with the loan water, also using the same approach, structural adjustment program. So they put money on the name of making management and policy on water more developed. But the background of that is also the same mission. How to liberalize the country water law. What I mean by that is the situation of water liberalization already happening since the first development era of Indonesia in 19 after 1960, yeah, after 1965, something like that. And the Watsal is a water and water adjustment water structural adjustment loan, things like that. So this is also loan 300 million euro, US dollar, putting to Indonesia, but not for things like, building water reserve, water treatment plant, like that, or dealing technical things, or like how to serve the population better, to extend the government duty in serving the water, like that. Not like that, but the Watsal, the 300 million from the World Bank, is a push for Indonesia to legalize the existing liberalization of water, because in Jakarta case since 1992, I guess the World Bank already came with another loan and start to argued the government to include private sector participation. So but now the situation is quite different, but what is happening is still the same. So the liberalization is still the same. Even the case of Jakarta water privatization is still exists. You mentioned that we managed to annul in 2013 the constitutional code, which is formed after the Reformation era in Indonesia, annulled the water law that is being an attachment of what shall loan by the World Bank, because the constitutional code, this is foreign interpretation, also not in line with our constitution, which water, land, food, and every strategic aspect of the nation should be on the management of the state for the greatest beneficiary of the people. So that's already being violated. That's basic constitution. So the World Bank annulled the World Bank imposed water law in Indonesia, the law number 7, year 2004. But what I need to say that the water law is being annulled, but the privatization already being very deep into Indonesia. Even after we won several cases in the Constitutional Court, in the Supreme Court, including in Jakarta case in District Court. But the receipts that being implanted by the World Bank, I have already been very deep into the Indonesia public system, I guess, the bureaucracy, the administration of public system. So the context is still the same, and what the impact of the loan from the past still hunting Indonesia, but now what is different is the things like the debt ratio to GDP also being things that being worried by many, because it's against the budget law already. It's more than 30%, but the government answering like the public outcry by saying that this is still considering low if we compare to developed country. But the question is that in the developed country, the loan being, or the public budget mostly being spending for public welfare like that. But in Indonesia, no, there's no outcome. There's no positive outcome of the debt, and we still have to face the privatization, which are coming with a lot of new phases. They used to use a structural adjustment program. Now they use the same approach. They call it what development, what they call it, development loan policy, thing like that. So it's still the same, so the money being used to develop policies, and those policies very much related to how the citizen being served, and also how the resource being treated. Aside from Jakarta privatization case, which is seemingly will continue with another form, they call it. The government now came with Indonesia term, but still the translation is private-public partnership. So the private is there. So, and most of the, I think it's a significant amount of the government spending is to pay debt service. So the like the interest of the debt, while at the same time the public spending for water never up to 1%. So we can see since the beginning the landscape of privatization already being in plan in very earlier process in the policy making process. So So I think the conflict between the need to serve public better, to have a better public service, and the threat from privatization also now they are no longer. I think they are both IMF and World Bank less bullish like in 90s, but they already inside Indonesia. You know, Indonesia have public company, Indonesia Infrastructure Finance, and the other is SME, and these two newly public company operate exactly as the same as the IFC, World Bank private hands like IFC. So like just private company like that. So I think I can say that Indonesia now developing its own World Bank and its own IMF with the same approach of development. Growth will create jobs and come the prosperity. So I think the main problem we have ideologically is the growth. As long as we are there, the problem still exists. The challenge will be more. I think I spent too much time. Still, do I still have time?
You have 2 minutes. Yeah.
Really? Okay. I think yeah, I will be closing with that. So the challenge is still the same, you know. We still have uh, to fight for the government not spending our money to pay the illegitimate debt, the historical debt. Jakarta privatization case is one of the example for that. But now the trend, what was happening in Jakarta also being extended in the other part of Indonesia. So what used to be World Bank and IMF mission now become the government mission. So I think it's no longer foreign, but we use foreign approach to dealing with our own country. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Reza. We see the similarity between the Philippines and Indonesia. And in your last words, it's like the internalization of these macroeconomic fundamentals and mechanisms for debt sustainability. Thank you very much for that. Now that we have a deeper understanding of the debt problem in South Asia through Bangladesh and Nepal, and in Southeast Asia through the Philippines and Indonesia, let's zoom out again and see all of this from a regional and global perspective. Let's hear from May Buenaventura, the Debt Justice Program Manager at APMDD, who will give us the regional and global trends as well as opportunities. She will also present on the common elements, actors, drivers of the debt problem, as well as the corresponding treatment to the problem. So may you have 12 minutes for your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. Wait, I cannot find my PowerPoint, so. Yeah, so first, just apologies that we've run over time, so we'll make this very quick. But okay, so I will share my screen now. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so I entitled this Asia's Debt Tsunami. And if you see the charts, no, it's really like that, no, like a wave that's overwhelming us. So we're still working on disaggregating this further, because if you use the World Bank, they group together East Asian countries and Pacific countries, and we have to disaggregate. But if you look at that, it's almost similar directions, trajectories. So going up, no, going up. This is the figure at the bottom is 2015, and the one on top is 2019. So even from the 2010, you see already the increase upward. So this was largely before the pandemic, and now this has deepened even more. This increase, as our speakers have mentioned, the deepening of the debt burdens further in light of the pandemic. Okay, so this is now just to show you that even just for the interest payments, we spend billions of dollars. No? So for example, in 2019, in Southeast Asia, that's already more than about a third of the total debt service payments due. And also billions in South Asia for interest payments alone. So you can imagine that in these difficult times that all this money is going into debt service, no, and not even not into services. This slide shows the type of creditors that that we have in South Asia and East Asia and the Pacific. So I just want to call attention to this red circle, no. So here on top you have the official creditors that we are more familiar with, which are the multilateral institutions, financial institutions, and also the bilateral debts from countries like the US, Japan, etc. This is the other component of the public debt is from the commercial and private lenders. And below that, if you look at the disaggregation, you see that a big part of that, for example, here in South Asia, owed to bondholders. So this is what Lydie was earlier explaining about these kinds of instruments that debt is sold and exchanged, like, you know, like basically papers, no? And so it's traded and retraded and goes round and round. And now it becomes more difficult to find out who is the actual holder of the debt, unlike the official creditors. So it's pretty much the same in East Asia and the Pacific, where it's even bigger, no? For private creditors, you have 513.3 billion, and more than 70% of the public debt. That is more than 70% of the public debt. And the debt from bondholders is already 62% of the total public and publicly guaranteed debt. So that's a difficult situation, which we will see later on in terms of debt relief schemes. So we also have these developments of the loans from China. So this is a representational map from World Bank showing in proportion to the size of the debt, the size of the rectangle or the square. No? So you see there with the largest debts, Pakistan in Asia, no? Pakistan and Laos and Cambodia, a little bit smaller here. So we're still looking into these developments in our debt landscape. But some criticisms have already emerged as to the transparency issues, compliance with environmental safeguards, labor rights, and so on. So this is another area that we must pay attention to in studying the debt situation here in our region. Now, what are the debt relief schemes being offered today? Because it's already, you know, everybody recognizes from the World Bank, IMF, OECD, the UN, they recognize that there is a problem with the debt, and it stands in the way of going forward, no? From their perspective, and also from ours, that it really stands in the way of any transformational directions forward. So one of these, I think also earlier mentioned, was hatched or announced by the G20. It's called the Debt Service Suspension Initiative. I missed the service there. And it took effect in May last year. and was supposed to end in December, but it was extended, but only up to end of this year. So what happens after 2021? That suspension is no longer applicable, and countries will be obligated to make the debt service payments again. And it only covers 73 countries. No? Most of these countries are in Africa. And then later on, the G20 and the Paris Club offer this agreement called the Common Framework for Debt Treatments Beyond the DSSI. And it's supposed to be an enhancement of DSSI, but it's also ridden with lots of problems. No? For example, it has to be initiated by the debtor or the borrowing country. And then the IMF and the World Bank will assess. They will be the ones to assess, no? If you are eligible for relief, and what amount of relief will that be? And then another one is, of course, you must be part of an IMF supported program, which we know very well from history and from the sharing of our colleagues, that this is the channel through which policy changes are made along neoliberal lines. So for example, VAT in Bangladesh was part of an IMF loan conditionality, the increase in VAT rates. And IMF has also its own window, which is called the Catastrophe Containment and Relief Trust. But significant here is that it is for paying IMF. No? It's to cover scheduled IMF repayments. And there are 25 beneficiary countries. So because it provides for short-term debt relief, that will also take away from the 500 million in the CCRT. So why are we criticizing these schemes? Now, what is wrong with these schemes? Well, you know, coming from Lidi's presentation earlier, you really see the similarities of how limited these schemes are, how very temporary they are. You know, they're just kicking the can down the road, and then we will feel the pain soon, no? After 2021, and that they involve very small amounts. What concerns us also, and this concerns a lot of us, because we may be considered middle income. Several countries in Asia are considered middle income by the international financial institutions, which we also question, no? Such categorization. But nonetheless, countries like Indonesia and the Philippines, they are not eligible. No? And it also involves meager amounts. It defers only 5.3 billion of 2020 debt service. There is also no mention, and not surprisingly, of unsustainable or unpayable debts, including odious and illegitimate debts, even if this has already been recognized in the UN and at one time even the IFIs. And the World Bank has also said it will not offer debt relief because it might hurt its credit rating. So it's really, you know, you really get angry because at this critical time when people are dying, they are afraid that they will lose their credit rating. And there is also no binding commitment by private creditors. So this is what I was emphasizing earlier on, that there's a huge chunk that are owed by Asian governments to private creditors, but they are not obliged to participate in debt relief. So they are simply encouraged or urged by the G7 and the G20 to be part of this, but they're not obligated. So in effect, knowing that there's funds for debt relief, this effectively bails out private lenders like BlackRock, HSBC, and other private lenders. No? Oh, so these debt relief schemes, you may have seen some of our actions that we call these false solutions, because they really do not address the core of the matter, and they only bring countries deeper into debt. So what the eligible Asian countries in the debt relief are only a few, like these ones I listed here. And this is a problem because, for example, Indonesia has a 51% exposure to private or commercial lenders. So what will happen to that? No? That will be, of course, a burden of the people. And then another thing is that there's been a rise in private sector bond issuances. So the trend began many years before in Southeast Asia, and then more recently there's been a leap in South Asia, driven largely by Sri Lanka. So you can see from this graph that excluding China, East Asia really has a lot of exposure to bond issuances, issued a lot of bonds. And then without China, still pretty significant there for East Asia and the Pacific. Now, as compared to so-called or as compared to countries which are eligible for debt relief in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. So those are publicly guaranteed, but we also need to pay attention to private non-guaranteed debt because in certain crisis situations, they could be bailed out, no? And this results in the public assumption of private debt. So you also see huge amounts here, no, in the billions of dollars that could later on be part of the public debt. Lydie also mentioned earlier domestic debts, which does not often come into the picture when the IFIs are talking, for example. So here I just mentioned a few: Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam, whose domestic debt is even bigger than their external debt. So we need to look at that as well. And then we have to also raise the issues of illegitimate debts. So we know this very well in APMDD as debts contracted in our name, in the people's name, and which we paid for or continue to pay with the use of public funds. So these are debts that we know did not benefit people, but in truth actually violated rights, destroyed the environment, bound us to highly onerous and unfair terms, and threatened even the future of generations yet to come because of, for example, an irreversible environmental impact. So I just cited a few of the examples here, but there's really a lot of them, especially now that we see the effects of fossil fuel projects, for example, on the climate. And we also have to note what Lydie mentioned earlier as contingent liability. So these are obligations contingent on the occurrence of particular events because the state has, it's increasingly taken a role as guarantor of services and projects. So one of the major channels is the PPPs, or the public-private partnerships. And even although the IMF recognizes the huge fiscal cost of the PPPs, it also promotes PPPs. So we look at the debt in a context where, I don't need to go into this anymore because our friends from South Asia and Southeast Asia shared very much about the impacts on people, no? On jobs, on poverty, on the deepening of poverty. And plus the fact that many of our countries in Asia are also among the most climate at risk, no? From the climate risk index, we're also up there among the top 10, no? And then, of course, as you heard from Rovic, there's been the IMF just reviewed their growth projections, and this has been influenced by the sheer problem with vaccine inequalities, the uncertainty over vaccine inequalities. So just a few of to end my presentation, just to remind us of the demands that we are raising for debt justice, and we will go into these more deeply in terms of actions in our next session, in our next and last session next week. First of all, the call for cancellation of unsustainable and illegitimate debt. So we say that there should be wider, deeper debt cancellation for all Southern countries from low to middle income by all lenders and creditors, official and private. So this should begin with at least in the next 4 years. So that should have started last year, and without penalties. And the savings or the public funds freed up should be spent, of course, on people's survival, no? On what they need the most at the moment, and also looking towards transformative change in terms of addressing deep-seated economic issues and climate change. So in the immediate, we don't want new loans for COVID fiscal response measures. So this is where we also have links to the tax and fiscal justice struggles and movements, where we say there are sources, and we shouldn't be able to depend or incur more debts to respond to COVID and the multiple crises. Third, a UN process and mechanism for comprehensively addressing unsustainable and illegitimate debt, and for the conduct of comprehensive debt audits by both lenders and borrowers. And fourth, the adoption of international and national rules for fair, just, and democratic lending and borrowing processes and contracts. So I think my last slide is just a reminder that all these struggles we do in the context of a bigger fight for system change. And we know that the debt is part of a broader struggle to transform this fundamentally flawed system that has been built on inequality in various dimensions, while destroying and devastating our people and our planet. So thank you very much. I will end there.
Thank you very much for that presentation, May. Indeed, there's a rising debt tsunami in Asia, not just for public debt, but also private debt, not just external debt, but also domestic debt. But the debt relief being offered is by the international financial institutions are too little, too late, and clearly false solutions. It's also good that you mentioned about illegitimate debts that have led to violence and harm to people and the planet. Much. Now we open the floor for questions, comments, and perhaps additional inputs from our speakers. If any of you would like to add more to your presentation. We have 15 minutes for Q&A. You can, if you're the shy type, you can type your question or comment on the chat box. And if you want to verbalize your question, just click on the raise hand button, and let's wait for us to acknowledge you. Thank you.
Can I just an addition, because I don't have
Yes, please, Reza, go ahead.
opportunity to share my presentation. I think this is just the latest thing. What I want to say that like a country like Indonesia, which is the member of G20, where the numbers, the data being used, being priced as one of the biggest economic development. And now we are at the state where most of our debt came from the internal source, but like Lydie mentioned that there's no control on the flow of the capital. So the foreign investor individually can also enter through the financial to buy government obligation. But the question is, the next question for Indonesia is how the government can pay for that, and that's where the commercialization pushing Indonesia right now, because like many other countries, the most of the speaker already also touched on that the okay, like in Indonesia case where the now the I lost it. Most of the loan come from domestic, but now the government is, I think Indonesia, like other Asian country, also the government is keep looking on Vietnam, for example, how the foreign direct investment, including loan, which is transformed with different mass now, come with significant contribution to number of economic growth. Just like in Indonesia, the foreign investor, including operators of natural resource or public services already being in Indonesia, they being given and still the bonus, the facility for them being keeping, aided by the government, that they don't need to pay uh, the tax. Many virus escape also free from income taxation, including like tax tax policy, which is for the benefit of the investor. Now, those companies that already being inside Indonesia in the public sphere, demanding that the government, commercializing the tariff of services like we have that in health service now, also water, and now the one of the biggest fight is in the electricity, because otherwise they claim that they already being put a lot of investment to develop that sectors, and now it need to to build the demand for that. And in our case in Indonesia, apart from that, Indonesia have a lot of natural resource, rich natural resource country, but also big population. So now they are transforming the natural resource and public services into the commodity, and they also turning the population into the buyer, into the consumer. So uh, in order to this kind of development to go on, in order for the government in the next period to be able to pay for the debt, uh, now they're demanding the increase of like electricity use. So the government is arguing the population, the citizen here to use more electricity. Sometimes they mix it with the need to transit to the need of transition to the renewable energy. It's being mixed up very badly. But one thing is coming. One thing that is the challenge for Indonesia is the rise of the public, not public, the rise of life spending, also tariffs in every essential services, because it was being demanded by the investor, by third party, and open to. So to put it as simple, they continue with market, with economic development as it used to be, and uh, the crisis will keep coming in the future. I think that's the same, because, and this is what I share, is one of the latest report from the World Bank, are like advising the government in order not to jump into the same mistake like the old regime in Indonesia, where the government had to sell a lot of public asset to pay for the debt. The same measure still being used now in order for the government to be able to manage the debt. The what is this? The selling of public asset need to be escalated very, what the word they use, mm, asset sales will be the most important thing to deal with. So privatization in many form will is something that coming in Indonesia, and I think the how to halt that deprivatization is necessary when also we're talking about fighting that. Thank you.
Thank you for that additional input, Reza. Yeah, the international system is really encouraging competitive advantage, but it's really more race to the bottom. So if you have low taxes, and that means more investors, but it's really for the benefit of the private sector, the transnational companies, rather than the people. So are there any other additional inputs and perhaps questions from our participants? I don't see any hands raised. as well as questions on the chat. We're still strong, participants 46 as of this hour, but if there are no more questions or additional inputs or comments, I'd like to give the floor to May to give a very quick summary of the major takeaways from this session. May, are you ready?
Yeah, thank you, Bruce. So not to repeat what has already been mentioned, but just to emphasize that we saw from the history that the debt problem did not develop overnight, and that it's been with us deepening and intensifying over several decades. But it has also taken on various forms that we need to be more aware of, forms that are direct and indirect. And there are changes, but also we see the same drivers. No, their faces may have changed, but they represent the same interests that use debt as an instrument for the continued transfer of resources from the south to the north. And the solutions we also see as being rehashed from before, no? And not really addressing the core problems why the debt problem remains with us and continues to deepen. We also saw how conditionalities are being used, which of course has an impact on the access to services for one, but also used as a way to change policy. So we saw this in Indonesia, in Bangladesh, also in the Philippines, that policies are changed, for example, in water sector, power sector, through the loan conditionalities. And we also heard about how debt service payments are being prioritized in the face of very urgent survival needs, in the face of COVID, in the face of the economic recession, the crisis of public health, and the climate crisis. We also noted the complicity or the responsibility of our own South governments in allowing, because IFIs need the governments to be able to change their policy through the governments. So with that, those are just few of the important points that were raised here. And I will just end there and turn it over to Bruce for the our last messages for next week. No?
Well, thank you very much to everyone for attending session 2 of the APMDD Debt Justice webinar series. We look forward to seeing you again next week, Wednesday, August 25, same time for the last last part of this series, which is debt justice campaigning in Asia, where we will look at the challenges and opportunities for campaigning from the national to regional and to the global levels. We will send you the invitation for session 3, which will include the flyer, the registration link. Again, on behalf of the Debt Justice Program at the APMDD, thank you very much. Have a great day and see you next week.